I'm happy to introduce our second speaker for today, Sonya Kupka with Dietitians of Canada. She's the Regional Executive Director for British Columbia, and she's been in this role since the spring of 2013. Sonya completed her undergraduate degree at the University of British Columbia and interned at the Victoria General Hospital in London, Ontario, and then went on to complete her master's in adult education at St. Francis Xavier University in Nova Scotia. Sonya started her career in clinical dietetics in Montreal and then returned to BC to work in public health nutrition, first in northern BC and then later in the Lower Mainland. Sonya has held several director positions within BC healthcare outside of food and nutrition, including having had responsibility for long-term care, home health, and mental health. She also was the inaugural director of the Secretariat for the BC Healthy Living Alliance. As a contractor, she worked with Dietitians of Canada on the Pan-Canadian Task Force on Public Health Nutrition and with the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences on national policy recommendations for transforming care for Canadians with chronic health conditions. So I'd like to welcome Sonya, who will be speaking on having difficult conversations.
That's great. Thank you very much, Teresa. And thank you very much for the opportunity to come here and to, or at least to be part of today's session. And let me throw as well the host here up in Prince George, where I was planning to come initially, and so it's lovely to be actually here and to be able to present remotely at this kind of an opportunity. I'm not sure whether or not participants know, but I actually wasn't the scheduled speaker for this. It was initially scheduled to be Peter Lamb, who I think is much more conversant in terms of having difficult conversations with interns. And when he was unable to participate, he suggested that I might be able to do it. And thank you for the planning committee for your trust in that, and Kara as well. It was a little bit daunting thinking about it. And Peter said, "No, Sonya, you're the master of diplomacy. No problem." Peter can be very persuasive. And I thought about it, and I thought, well, you know, yeah, I am pretty good at diplomacy. I've worked with enough CEOs, I've done enough politics, and worked with all different levels of government. I've got diplomacy pretty well down pat. I'm comfortable with that, but I think it's very difficult than what we're talking about today around having difficult conversations. A lot of the diplomacy, it may be negotiating, coming up with some kind of an agreement, but it's often navigating some very sensitive areas that you go around. And I think that what we're talking about with some of the conversations that need to take place in this context, it's really moving through the conversation in a different kind of a way. And so by saying that, I'm admitting that I'm by no means the expert in this area. And so I'm really learning along with you, and look forward to, as we go through a few case studies, seeing how it applies in our various areas. I did receive some feedback myself from when I did a presentation. I present to the third-year students at UBC every year, and they're always happy to give some feedback at the end. And what would you do differently? So I trust that will be on my evaluation again this time. And I was advised to speak a little slower. So I will endeavor to do that again and invite the audience here to say, slow down a little bit. If I go too quickly, I know, especially being remote, that can be a challenge. So thinking of remote, I just would like to briefly check in with the remote sites to see what the audience is like. And maybe what I'll do is I'll call out the site and just ask you to give me a quick response, or I was about to say, hearing no response, I'll assume that you're okay, but that might not be the case. Teresa and Kara, are you okay in terms of the volume in Vancouver? How about in Kelowna? Lisa?
Yeah, you sound great, Sonya, thanks.
Great, thank you. Sylvia in Abbotsford? Are you there, Sylvia, in Abbotsford? They're on mute, or they got coffee as well. So I'll come back to that. How about Dawn in Kamloops?
Hi, yeah, everything's good here, thanks.
Great, thank you. Jean in Surrey?
10-4.
Awesome. Jacob in Victoria?
Yep, you're all clear.
Super. Now, I don't have pictures of anybody in the remote site, so I don't know if there's any way to switch that, just as an aside. Tracy in Nanaimo, can you hear?
Hi. Yeah, there's 4 of us in the room.
Awesome. Thank you, Tracy. Castlegar. Karen.
Yes, there's 6 of us here in Castlegar.
Super. In Victoria, Jennifer.
Hi, we're all good, thank you.
Excellent. In North Vancouver, Sharon Lee.
All good in North Shore, thanks.
Okay, how about in Kelowna, Jacqueline?
Kelowna, we're good. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Campbell River, Jessica?
Hi, Sonia. It's just me, and I'm here.
Great. Well, thanks for hanging in there. That's hard to do on your own. Dina and Duncan. Okay. Christy and Victoria. Maybe Christy joined the other group. This is the list that I had from Kara, so I'm not sure. Miranda and Fort St. John.
Loud and clear.
Excellent. And in 100 Mile House, Colleen.
Yes, I'm here, thank you.
Wanda in Comox. Maybe not. And how about Bronwyn and Port McNeill?
Yep, still here. It's all good.
Super. Thank you. So we're just missing Sylvia and Abbotsford, maybe Dina and Duncan.
Yep.
Comox and... Oh,
Abbotsford, we can hear you. Thanks.
oh, awesome. Thank you. So I'm going to go ahead, recognizing that maybe in Comox and in Duncan they had to step out, but I'm glad everybody could hear me, so thank you for your patience on that. So today, where to go through? I thought just by setting some context, just to share some survey results, which may or may not be familiar with you, just to put the context of having difficult conversations there for us. To talk about a framework to identify and tools to respond to crucial conversations. I'm going to share with you actually some materials that Peter had shared with me and that I started using and found actually really practical. And then to apply the tools to scenarios from the interns and the preceptors. Many of you were very kind to share some difficult conversations you've had, and that's really the basis of this conversation. So next slide, please. I think by way of context, this is a survey that UBC had conducted of graduates from 2007, and it should read 2012, looking at overall satisfaction of the internship. Satisfaction is really high. It's really high. There's only 5% that are dissatisfied. And so I think that that's something to really keep in mind as we're working. I mean, as preceptors, you guys are doing a great job. Otherwise, we wouldn't have only 5% that are happy. So I think that's a really important context to keep out there as we're striving to improve. And that 30% are very satisfied, I'd say is really good. Next slide. And digging a little bit deeper in terms of, areas of possible improvement, if you look at a number of measures on it, I mean, generally, the first couple measures, I think the students are really keen to get out there and actually apply and practice their learning in the real world area and finding that very useful, that balancing between applied and observational learning. There's a couple of points that as preceptors we can pay attention to. The flexibility to accommodate student learning needs. I think that's something that we're always working towards, and preceptor effectiveness. So that was identified, but still it's 75% that were satisfied. So taking a look at, in this case, the 13% that are dissatisfied, why might that be? So if we go to the next slide, this is the context that I think that's really important to keep there. There's a master's student, Christina, who was from Ryerson University, and she worked with Monica Leafhaber from Interior Health, Marlene Wyatt from Dietitians of Canada, and she looked at not just dietetics, but looked at all kinds of that have some kind of a preceptor kind of a program, and asked them, what are the challenges that you face? And also there was a number of key informative interviews of preceptors of dietitians or dietetic students in Canada, and they came up with these 6 cluster areas. There's lots of logistical issues, and you're more familiar with them than I am in terms of part-time, lack of space, a feeling of lack of time, negative feelings. Maybe you have caseload after caseload, or maybe you have intern after intern. There's some student-related concerns. There's some concerns about lack of recognition, lack of training. So there's a number of reasons why it can be challenging to be a preceptor. And so I think as we're doing the skill development and focusing on that, it's always helpful to know the context that we're coming with, is that some of the stuff as preceptors we can control, and some of the stuff we can't. You can certainly advocate around the space issue, for example, to have a proper space to be able to accommodate a student, but at the end of the day, you may not be in the decision-making position around that. And so this is an area that we can focus on, that we do have some control on, how we manage our own individual conversations. So I just wanted to share that, to acknowledge that I think that there is an understanding that, that there are challenges around preceptorship that we're all working towards trying to address. The next slide, please. And so just wanted to take a minute out to say thank you to the preceptors, and now I'll clearly put on my Dietitians of Canada hat in terms of expressing thank you on behalf of advocating for the profession. There's things that we can certainly work on in terms of changing it. The other piece that I think that as Dietitians of Canada, and particularly me here in BC, that I'm very interested in is the recognition piece. Is there something that we can do as your professional association to be able to provide more recognition? Last year, a small token is we did provide pens for anybody who had been preceptoring. And so assuming that all of you have pens that wanted them at this point, then trying to think, okay, what else can we do in terms of a small token of appreciation and recognition for your role? It may be a letter to your employer. That's one idea that I'm sort of tossing around there if I can work through the logistics. It may be a prize draw. So I'm looking for some kind of an ideas. And so I put the invitation out for preceptors in the audience to share with me what might be meaningful for you to have some form of recognition. Again, being one piece of the list of challenges that preceptors are working with here in BC and across the country. And then again, coming back to that there's only 5% dissatisfaction rate. So if there is a day that's a little bit discouraging, that's a good thing to remember to keep in context. So next slide, please. So again, I'll credit Peter Lamb here for this idea in terms of, I said, well, where would you start with this, Peter? And he said, well, I'd probably start with a survey. You know, ask the dietitians and the interns what kind of conversations they've had. And so I put the call out, and from the responses, thank you very much for those of you that did respond. 4 out of 5 interns said they had a difficult conversation, and I didn't define what difficult was. I let that be self-defined. And 13 out of 22 preceptors had a difficult conversation. Well, what surprised me is I thought, why didn't all respondents experience difficult conversations? Is it possible to go through a year internship without having a difficult conversation from either a preceptor perspective or an intern perspective? But maybe I'm just projecting based on my own internship experience many years ago. But then I dug into it further. What really is a difficult conversation? And the next slide. And in this next slide, I'll draw upon, again, some of the research that comes from a book called Crucial Conversations by Patterson, Grenny, McMillan, and Swisler. And it's a good, easy read. It has case studies embedded in it, good summaries at the end. And I'll pull out of it the sections that certainly resonated with me. And how they define a critical conversation is saying that there has to be 3 elements that are present. Opposing opinions. That's pretty obvious. You know, there wouldn't be really some kind of a discussion back and forth if there weren't differences in opinions. But then what makes it crucial? What makes it something that if you enter into that conversation effectively, you can make a really big difference? And why is it that some conversations are sensitive and some conversations aren't? The other elements they suggest is that strong emotions and high stakes need to be put into place. If there's no emotions and there's nothing at stake, it's not going to be a critical, difficult conversation. It's just a comment. High stakes, if you think of high stakes in the internships, these interns have a lot invested. When they come up and they meet up with a preceptor, they know the position that they're in. They know that they're very close to being a dietitian, and they can't be a registered dietitian without successfully completing the internship. So for them, the stakes are really, really high. In terms of strong emotions, I mean, with those high stakes, they're going to bring the emotions. And I think the other piece in terms of strong emotions is we as preceptors bring emotions to it as well. We can't help but bring the emotions if we bring all ourselves into a situation. And again, thinking back on the challenges, sometimes those emotions may run higher than others. And then there's, just separate from that, the interaction or the issue where the opposing opinion might be. A comment from one of the survey respondents was, I've had a few situations where there's been issues with performance, and that talking about issues is always challenging. And so if I look at the examples that people shared with me around the difficult conversations they've had, typically it is around performance expectations. That makes sense. Casual conversations transform into crucial ones. And so as preceptor, you may think that it's really not a big conversation, but then you get partway through it, you were just giving some simple feedback and it becomes something completely different. And I think at that point, then you might say, ooh, this is not what I had planned at that point, but it becomes a real opportunity to take it somewhere that you may want to take it. The other piece that I thought was helpful to think about is the more crucial the conversation, the less able we are to handle it well, just because, again, the emotions get involved in the stakes. And so that's what this is about, is really trying to make some of this so embedded that it's easier to work through. Next slide, please. So possible responses to crucial conversations. Again, in this book, they outline 3 strategies, and all of them were very familiar to me, especially the first one. We can avoid them. That was originally my go-to, and it still continues to be at times. And I would argue that there's some times where it's not a bad thing to avoid a conversation. When the emotions are running so high, when something catches us by surprise, maybe not avoiding, but deferring, there's nothing wrong with that at times. One of the comments from a preceptor was, I tried avoiding the upsetting the intern, but in the end, there were no improvements made. And so that's the downside of avoiding a crucial conversation rather than just postponing it. We can face them and handle them poorly. I've done that many times. One of the results from a preceptor was, I think there have been many times when maybe I've not been as clear as I would have liked, and the intern did not seem to fully understand and appreciate my concerns. Well, we've all felt that at times. And you know what? That's okay. Because again, that's probably better than completely avoiding it. I mean, maybe not fully understand and appreciate, but there's been some progress made. And then there's what we probably all strive for. We can face them and handle them well. And here's a really good example. The outcome was good, I think, as it was done in a respectful way with examples to indicate why the conclusion was reached. I love this quote. Don't aim for perfection, aim for progress. And so one of the things as we're going through these crucial conversations is just to be able to learn from them. I like this insight shared by another preceptor, and it was, I had difficult conversations throughout the rotation when an intern was not doing well. It turned out fine. I had support from my practice lead. And so I think that's a really good example where somebody was aiming for progress. And so maybe as a preceptor, recognizing about lifelong learning, needing to be able to brainstorm a little bit, maybe to move ahead, and then continuously improving as we go through. Another quote, when the topic turns from things to people, it's always more difficult. And to nobody's surprise, some people are better at it than others. We could argue some people are natural at it. Maybe some people practice more, they have more opportunity. And some people maybe just really want to keep at it and looking for feedback themselves around it. So the next slide, please. The next slide is tools for crucial conversations, and this is just a bit of a snapshot of how I thought to move through this presentation is to present a principle out of the book, some of the skills that they suggest, and then using a case study from a preceptor and how it seemed to me that they may have used that principle and that skill. And so in this book, they talk about the 4, the start with heart, the learn to look, the make it safe, the explore each other's paths. It's very interesting going back to Dan's presentation just a couple of hours ago, you're going to hear very similar themes. And it's probably stuff that you've heard before. I mean, it's not rocket science. What I found interesting is really to take a look at case studies and to try and layer it on top of it. And then there's some, like I said, some interesting tools that come through that might be helpful for your practice. Next slide, please. So starting with heart, working on me first, and it was interesting again coming back to Dan's recent presentation. One of the books he suggested was about heart. So it seems like we're all talking about heart these days. That's where we try to come from a position, and part of the plain rationale on that is because at the end of the day we can only control ourselves, and part of that is just resisting devolving from correcting mistakes to winning. And I think that there's a fine point in terms of we give feedback, or certainly I do, and then at some point I just want to be right. I just wish I could have that comfort at times. Now, I'll use a really personal example, trying to think of starting with heart. And it was to do with my stepdaughter. And my stepdaughter doesn't live with us. She lives in Germany, so we have this remote arrangement. And she's 15. And so you can imagine that in itself. I have a whole lifetime of difficult conversations with her. I don't think we've had a conversation that's not difficult. The stakes are really high for both of us. The emotions are really high. We don't see each other. It's all condensed into our visits 2-3 times a year. And in terms of different opinions, she's 15, I'm 50. Finding that common ground sometimes doesn't come that naturally. And she had lived with us for 5 months, and I had convinced myself ahead of time it was going to be a disaster, and it was that self-fulfilling prophecy. I clearly did make it a little bit of a disaster. So when she came back the next time, I thought, nope, I'm really going to try and change this. And how can I change these conversations? And so when I looked at the framework, the Start with Heart, I really did think of the questions, what do I really want out of this? And I kept asking myself that and asking myself that. So what do I really want for myself? What do I really want for her? What do I want for this relationship? Well, for myself, I want to have some peace in my family. I want to feel good about myself after we spend time together. I want to feel like I'm a kind of a half-decent stepmom, that at least I'm doing my best. What do I really want for others? I want her to have a good experience. I want her to have a good experience in the family. And what do I want for the relationship? Respect, compassion, and understanding. And so I was able to use that over and over again throughout the whole visit, and committing to have it all, that we can have an honest relationship, and we can disagree, we can agree, not just disagree, and we can disagree and still have a good relationship. So those 3 elements I found easier initially to use in a personal kind of a context, starting with heart. And then I took that concept and I thought, well, let's take it one step further and apply it to a situation for a preceptor. So if we look at the next slide, a preceptor starts with heart. My apologies for the small font. I just didn't want to edit the scenarios extensively. So the preceptor had said, I had to advise a student they were not going to pass the internship because they had repeated clinical rotation twice and were struggling with workload expectations, and their knowledge was weak. High stakes, strong emotions, opposing opinions, definitely a crucial conversation that would be happening there. So that's the context. The preceptor, after listening to all the reasons why the intern was struggling, usually the fault of others, so a little bit of sensitivity there, some emotions, we then delved deeper into what they thought was the reason they were struggling and their real interests relating to the food and nutrition field. The chat took about an hour. Hard to know whether or not that was scheduled or anticipated, but the preceptor went with it and made the time. The intern eventually acknowledged they don't really like clinical, but their passion was research. If it had been a 5-minute chat, it may not have gotten to that point. At this point, we were able to discuss various options, employers, etc., where this person could pursue that passion. What started on a low point concluded with the person feeling good about themselves, recognizing their true passion, and that they, in fact, weren't a failure. So a really good example of a difficult conversation that was handled really well. And I'm not sure what was going through the preceptor's mind as they handled it. It could very well have been intuitively. If it may be going through the preceptor's mind, there could have been some questions about starting with heart, thinking about, well, what do I really want for myself? Well, as a preceptor, I want to be proud of my profession. I'm taking on this and spending time with students because I want to strengthen and have really great dietitians that are out there working. What do I really want for the intern? I found this an interesting question because initially, I had thought, well, if I was in that situation, what do I want for the intern? I want them to pass the rotation. I want them to complete their internship successfully. It seems that this preceptor was able to shift from that to dig a little deeper. What do I want for the intern? For them to be successful in the workforce, no matter where they were. It happened to be a clinical rotation. But what that preceptor was able to do through some kind of introspection or intuition or whatever it was, but if she asked herself, what do I want for the intern? And dug deep enough, that might be where she got or he got. What do I want for the relationship? And that also just thinking of trust and respect. And I think if we ask ourselves, what do we want for the relationship, we may be preceptoring one day and then colleagues not that far after, because we do end up hiring a lot of the interns, which is part of the beauty of it. And so always thinking with our preceptors, what do I want for that kind of relationship? So to me, when I saw that example from the preceptor, I thought this is a great example where the concept of starting with heart can be applied really well. I have my notes here in front of me, but I mentioned already that I'm 50. I don't know, those of you that have hit that, but at some point it seems to do something to the eyes, and I can't read anything below a 10-point font. So I'll trust that I covered what was on there. The next slide, please. Learn to look. And again, this was touched on in Dan's presentation, so I see there's really good synergy in terms of the perspectives we were both coming from. And if we make it safe enough, people can talk about anything and listen without becoming defensive. And so when we hear somebody becoming defensive, then that's a really good sign that someone's feeling unsafe. And defensiveness can, manifest itself. In this book, they refer to it as silence and violence. I don't really like the term in this context, violence. It sounds a little bit harsh, but it rhymes with silence, so I think that's why they chose it. So we'll work with it. And it's a nice way to remember it. But what they're saying in terms of signs are things that we might not always think about it. So, for example, silence, masking. I'm really good at this one. So if I'm starting to feel really unsafe, then I can put on my biggest smile and just say, oh, really, is that your opinion? Okay, well, let's think about that. And just completely glaze over it. Avoiding. My stepdaughter, she spent a lot of time in the basement watching TV. That's a very familiar one. And then when I finally got her in the car and she couldn't escape, I thought, excellent, I've got her. Well, of course she withdrew. I mean, it still wasn't a safe kind of environment for her. I just had her trapped in this little prison of the car, which in hindsight I realized was rather unfair. But anyways, I'm mending my ways on that. Violence, controlling, trying to dominate in the conversation, labeling or attacking, all of those may be very uncomfortable responses to get back from an intern if we're in some kind of a situation trying to work with them and give them feedback. Really, if we can just remember that there's signs of not feeling safe, then it's a little bit easier to respond to that kind of a response. And this is a big one, avoiding getting caught up in the content and being blind to the conditions. It's really hard not to be task-oriented at times. We've got a lot to do, we want to go through it, and yet that's the content. And if we can sometimes step back and be aware of the conditions, and I was thinking of that graph that had been up there about creating a safe kind of environment. I thought that that's really looking at the context. So let's look at an example of what it's like when an intern feels safe. So next slide. So this is what happens when an intern feels safe. And this is the words of the intern. The coordinator made me feel safe, heard, and that my best interest was her priority. And it's interesting because on the previous slide, I didn't read it out, but when we talked about when people feel safe enough, they'll say just about anything. And what they need to feel safe, and we'll get into that a little bit further, is to believe that the person feels that your intentions are the best. And that was exactly what she had said. So it was interesting, the wordings ended up being very similar. So what this intern had said, she said, despite the bad situation, I trusted it would work out. Now this is at the end, in June when it's over. And she says, now that it's after the fact, the situation didn't really work out. But the preceptor at the time did exactly what I needed. She listened. And so this must have been a pretty tough situation for the intern have to go through and have to experience. And she came out of it feeling really good. And so kudos to the preceptor as to how they handle that, because obviously they did it well in terms of making it safe, recognizing whether or not it was safe. A couple more examples from preceptors on conditions. So if we can go to the next slide. Understanding others' conditions and then judge their context. So this is coming from a preceptor. The intern came to her rotation inadequately prepared. There were several assigned readings and questions to be completed before the beginning of the rotation so that the concepts from the reading could be discussed and patients were encountered. kind of a familiar process, not unreasonable, you would think. The intern was asked to complete the readings and questions, and the importance of coming prepared was noted, because the intern didn't manage to prepare that. And so at this point, the preceptor could have asked, well, how did you feel coming into this rotation? I understand you weren't able to complete the reading. What would you have liked to done differently? So there could have been some probing happening there in terms of what happened. Maybe there was, maybe there wasn't. But something to try and get at maybe what the context was. Why didn't they do the reading is what you're trying to get at. Clearly it impacted their learning and they're suffering the consequence from it, but why did it happen? And then, because there may have been a good reason for it, and you might want to know that. I had a really great big dinner party this week and I couldn't find the time. Then that's one context. My brother-in-law just passed away and had to go comfort. That's a completely different context. So by poking a little bit to find that out, that can help you to prepare for the conversation that might come after. The other piece that I thought was interesting from this, the comment was this happened to two different interns. Life happens, lots of stuff happens. In both cases, there were significant things going on in the personal lives that made it difficult to complete their homework at home. So there was some stuff going on that may have been valid, that may have been quite understandable, and that you might want to handle it differently. The other piece that I'd throw out, coming back to the first thing, is work on me. How realistic are my expectations of interns who have lives out of rotations? And so if this happens to every intern, then it's a chance for us to look back and say, well, gee, were my expectations reasonable of the intern, that none of them are able to do it? Or was it really the context that they're in? So I think the whole idea of just being able to ask a bit. In this book, they have a couple of YouTube clips, and there was one YouTube clip, and it was great. I wanted to bring it, but we weren't sure about the technology, and I'm actually really glad I didn't, because we've had enough glitches to try and work through. But it was a split screen kind of an image about, it was a manager who was about to give one of her staff a performance appraisal, and she's chatting with one of her colleagues. Oh, I can't believe I have to do another performance appraisal. I was very clear. I gave him instructions that, for him to be able to be successful, he needs to do A, B, C. He needs to be able to, clean up. And, she felt that she was being very clear. And I'm going to have to put him on, 30 days notice, shape up or ship out. And then you see her staff member. And he is very proud. He's all dressed up. And he says, you know what? I got this feedback 6 months ago. I did everything that she said. I cleaned up my act. I'm showing up all the time. And, I think this is going to be great. I think I'm up for a promotion. So completely different stories. One step further, the manager, she said, and I don't feel good if I have to let him go, but I do know that his partner has an amazing job. And so at least financially, it won't be a big stress for them. It goes back to the other man. And then the other man, he says, oh, and I forgot to tell you that of the news. My wife is pregnant. Yep, she's going to be delivering, and she's going to be delivering really soon. Now, I know that she's a consultant, so she has no mat leave. So good thing I have this job to take care of my family. And so that's an example where having that little bit of context, not that it would change the decision, but it might be helpful to know ahead of time in terms of how things are framed. So I thought those were a couple of good examples in terms of context. Let's take another look at conditions in the next slide. And I think that it's easy to think of the condition and, what's the context for the interns that they're coming in, what's going on in their lives and how it might be affecting it. And I think at the same time, if we take a look at what's going on in our lives, what are our conditions and how that might impact our behaviors, because that can influence the content. So here's an example from another intern. And the intern said, based on how I felt my performance was during part of a rotation and knowing interns had many difficulties with the said preceptor, I felt extremely down and upset with my progress during the rotation. Based on her body language, the way she tested me, and her reactions to some of my answers, I felt like I was going to fail the rotation. And this is, again, you'd think Dan and I compared notes before we went in there. I paraphrased it slightly differently. I think he said, they may not remember what you say, but they'll remember how you made them feel. I've paraphrased it here, and I said your interns may not remember all what you taught them, the content, but they will remember how you made them feel, the conditions. So in this case, the intern isn't feeling really great. The intern is a little bit anxious based on the context. But it's interesting, the twist that happens here. After a few days in the rotation, at the end of the day when she was more available, and so this tells me what's the context for the preceptor. Maybe the preceptor was supposed to be on vacation to go as a result of having taken on the intern. Maybe the preceptor happened to be sick or had things going on in her own life or his own life. And so there could be some stuff going on outside of that. So at this point, the preceptor was available. And the intern asked the preceptor if she had any feedback of how I was doing, if there were things I could work on, etc. And here's another example of a conversation that was obviously handled really well. Because after the conversation, I realized I was doing much better than I thought, and my preceptor and I were able to develop a much more open, comfortable relationship environment for the rest of the rotation. And so it's interesting that the whole point about the frequency of the feedback and being able to have that conversation and be able to handle it. And it's hard to know how much the intern shared, but it would have been helpful if the intern had the opportunity to share, gee, you know, I thought I wasn't going to make it. And then the preceptor could have had the chance, well, what made you think that? And to be able, that could have been a whole other conversation that may or may not have taken place. But again, it's understanding our own context as well as the context of the interns that we're working with and realizing how that can trump content. Next slide, making it safe. So we talked about being able to look at environments and find out whether or not they're feeling safe. Do we see our interns getting defensive? Well, when we do, then what do we do about it? I think this is the hardest piece. Sometimes, you know, it's, well, gee, I can tell that person's not feeling comfortable, but not knowing how to navigate through that. If we can step out of the conversation and the focus on the safety, and so it's really hard if we're in the middle of giving feedback to an intern and they're clearly not feeling comfortable, it may be time to take a break to giving the specific context, like giving the specific performance evaluation, to take a step back to address the situation and then come back to the feedback. So I thought these were three interesting strategies. Apologize when it's appropriate. And that, I mean, it's if we're wrong or we slipped into disrespect. And a good example of that, I'll think of a personal one. If I think of, for my son, I have a 6-year-old. And sometimes I get a little impatient. And sometimes my impatience doesn't come across most effectively. I bet there's some moms out there smiling, and I might say, what were you thinking of when you knocked over that glass of milk to get the Cheerios? And, you know, that's not exactly a respectful way to communicate to a 6-year-old because, you know, of course he wasn't thinking of the glass of milk. His Cheerios were there. He was on the way to going it. And in that kind of a context, depending how much sleep I've had, I can step back and I can say, I'm really sorry. You know, I didn't mean to say that. This wasn't the best way to handle it. So that's just a small example. And I also ended up where it was a little bit, the stakes were a bit higher with my stepdaughter, where I'd be preparing some meals and she chooses not to eat the food on the table. And we're dietitians, you know, we know in terms of Ellen Satter. And so I'm like, you know, I just offer the foods and she gets to pick what she wants from it. Well, the emotions were high, the stakes were high. Oh, you don't eat anything. And then it's out of my mouth and it's out there and I'm thinking, okay, it's out there, it's on the table, this isn't going to help. And just saying, wow, I'm sorry, you know, you do eat, obviously. You're still here, you're doing fine. You choose your own foods most of the time. That wasn't what I meant. What I meant was. And so sometimes the apologies, especially in a kind of a context, depending on the context, can be harder to do than others. But certainly it can go a long ways, and we've got a good example of that coming up. Contrasting to fix misunderstandings. This I find even more powerful because it's not necessarily taking back what we've said. Sometimes I find I apologize when I really don't need to, because sometimes it's not that I was wrong or disrespectful. It's a different kind of an opinion. So there's no point in apologizing and taking back what I said if I think it's something that I really mean. But at the same time, by contrasting to fix a misunderstanding, it's not that I mean that you don't eat anything. But what I'm trying to say is I feel really disappointed if I've put effort into a meal and you're choosing not to eat. And so it's the idea of saying, it's not that I think this is what I think. And I've got some more examples from preceptors that we can build on for that. Creating a mutual purpose, I think this is something that we're more familiar with. Taking a step back and thinking that our belief isn't the one and only. So let's take a look at an apology on the next slide. So here's again an intern, and the intern says, during my relief I had 2 separate preceptors which made meeting expectations really challenging. if we jump to the bottom, not the colored font in between, what the intern said is the outcome of the conversation allowed me to express why I had made decisions I had made, and for my preceptors to see I was applying feedback I had received from someone else. And so something happened in between there that really worked for the intern. And maybe it was an apology. I don't know. But that would be an example where that could work really well in terms of if you got an intern saying, well, you know, this preceptor said this preceptor said this, then gee, you know, I'm sorry, I didn't know you had been told to chart differently. There's nothing wrong, because it's not the intern's fault that they were told to chart differently, and it's not necessarily, you don't need to apologize for giving corrective feedback, but to apologize for the piece that the intern had two different pieces of information, that's kind of fair enough. I think this goes on a little bit too far, but I like some of the wording, so I included it anyways. The whole notion of building safety and trust. I'm sorry that you received mixed messages. We need to talk about this. I'm glad you brought this up. Thank you for taking the risk, and I appreciate the trust that it shows in me. And like I said, that might be going on a little bit too long, but in some contexts, a little bit of an apology can go a long way. Let's take a look at contrasting as a form of prevention on the next slide. The most difficult conversations I've had with interns in the first few weeks of acute care are in the first few weeks of acute care rotations. This is the phase when, as the acute care 1 preceptor, I need to encourage them to raise the bar if they're going to tackle the steep learning curve ahead of them. The outcome has always been working harder, but emotionally I feel like I've deflated them. I struggle with the type A personalities and the ability not to take things personally. And so here, a preceptor, they're reflecting in terms of thinking about how can I help them to be prepared and to let them know what's up ahead of them while not having that kind of an emotional impact and not taking things personally. That's the defensiveness, right? That's the safety piece coming out. So here's an application of this idea of contrasting. I don't want you to think that I expect you to have all the answers in your first acute care rotation. And so that could be something that the interns feel. If they're a perfectionist, I should know it all. I've been to university in a dietetics program for 2 years and I should be out there practicing. Well, just right there putting it out, it's okay. You know, we don't need to. I do want you to know that I recognize that you have really good knowledge base for clinical nutrition, so still building on the positive, and that it'll take time and commitment to translate this knowledge into effective nutrition intervention skills. And so it's still getting the whole concept forward and the point around needing to raise the bar, while not hopefully emotionally deflating them, knowing that they've got this strong knowledge base and knowing at the same time that it's okay if they don't know it. So that's some ideas in terms of using contrasting as a preventive. The last skill, mutual purpose, if we can flip to the next slide. And here's another really good example where a preceptor has applied the whole idea of looking and listening and identifying whether or not there's safety there. The scenario is reviewing the evaluation and explaining how a lack of skill or progress has resulted in a failing placement. That must be a very difficult conversation for any preceptor to have. This preceptor shares that I found a focus on behaviors and skills particularly beneficial, but often there's still defensiveness and resentment from the intern. Again, those high stakes into it. I provide formative feedback throughout the placement so that there's no surprises. So lots of good things happening there in terms of applying feedback. So one way to apply the contrasting could be, I don't want you to think that I've made this decision lightly. I do need to let you know that you've not met the competencies required to successfully complete this placement. So that's the whole notion of using the contrasting and the idea of making it safe. So this is a preventive effort at trying to get towards the defensiveness, because of course if there isn't the safety, it's really hard for the interns to listen. The preceptor says, I start the final conversation with a question about how they feel they did and progressed. And again, that's a great probing skill. Tell me why you found this challenging. It's recognizing the purpose behind the strategy. So strategy, what might have, not only how did they feel about it, but why did they think that they might have gotten to that situation? And then that paves the way to try and have some kind of a mutual purpose. And the mutual purpose in this case may be, we all want you to successfully complete your internship. You can test that idea as, You know, is that something that we agree with? I want you to complete your internship. You know, is this something that you really want? I think this is something that this organization really wants, and having accepted you and selected you to be a part of this team. So that's the idea of together creating some kind of mutual purpose. Or maybe something, as in the example before, successful in the workplace, maybe it's no longer completing the internship. And then testing the idea, let's find ways to meet these competencies and further develop yourself in the next placement. Brainstorming new strategies. And all of these, I'm sure, as preceptors are things that you've tried and tested at one point or another. And so I'm just really hoping that this might be a framework that adds to that. So one more area on the next slide, and then we'll get into some examples as a group. Exploring others' past, starting with listening. I'm sure you've heard these before: ask, mirror, paraphrase, prime, and then you talk. And these are the ABCs: agree, build, and compare. Agree where you share views. Avoid turning subtle differences into disagreements. Sometimes when we listen to arguments, and I listen to myself arguing with my husband sometimes, and I'm thinking, we're not even disagreeing. We're just talking about very small differences in terms of, you know, are we going to be going at 7 or at 9? We're going. You know, it's a small detail in terms of if it's 7 or 9. So instead of hooking on to the 5 or the 7 or the 9, to really focus on the agreement. Great. I'm glad that we're leaving. I'm glad that we're going out tonight. Building. Others leave something out. Agree when you share on views, and then add additional elements. Okay, I'm glad that we're going. You know what? Our son isn't going to be home until 5 o'clock, so it's going to be really hard for us to leave much before then, because we probably need to feed him. So, you know, what do you think about that? So adding additional information that may have been missing initially. And comparing when you differ, rather than suggesting he or she is wrong. I'm not very good at this. No, we have to leave at 7. He has to eat. And so, again, starting a bit more tentative, but having some kind of a candid opening. So let's try this. Next slide. I'm just going to do one slide because, again, I think this is something that you're pretty familiar with in terms of listening. Advising the intern to use more engagements with the patients during interviewing is the scenario. I provided an example that may work around asking, how comfortable are you with patients during interviews? Oh, I'm perfectly comfortable. I'm just great, thank you. Then, okay, then you know in terms of how the intern might be feeling, and then maybe that later or at that same scenario. Oh, okay, well, I noticed there was very little eye contact during the last interview. You know, are you comfortable with this patient? And yeah, I'm completely comfortable with them. Okay, let's see if I've got this right. You find it difficult, or to try and probe a little bit further, if they say, well, you know, yeah, I'm comfortable, but, you know, I need to get it right, and I need to have my notes right here, like I am right now when I'm presenting. And then paraphrasing back, okay, let me see if I've got this right. You find it difficult to have eye contact because you want to be sure you cover all the information that you need for a complete assessment. And so that's sort of building on some information. And then prime, and I thought this was a really good example from one of the preceptors. I used examples how I have grown over time and provided some real examples how this could be improved. Also noted this would improve over time, and with the experience, interns receive this fairly well. And so that whole notion, the whole idea of priming the pump is putting in our personal experiences. And we certainly have enough of those in terms of going through the internships ourselves that we can feed into it, or as we're practicing. So on to the ABCs then on the next slide. A preceptor uses her ABCs. So this might be a familiar scenario for some of you. The intern thought they were ready for staff relief when in nutrition care too, even though they were missing some basic steps. Students are going to be really keen after they've finished university to get out there, and they want to practice. And in some professions, you do practice without an internship. Not so many of the health ones, but often they get out there and they get to practice soon. So they're keen and want to get started. So in this case, the preceptor responds, I hear that you want more independence. Listening, you know, she's listening, she's mirroring, paraphrasing, and, you know, I agree. Yep, you had more independence last week, so this is getting into the ABCs. And then building on it, so not saying, no, you're not going to have independence, but yeah, I agree you had more independence. These patients are sicker. These nutrition interventions are higher risks. So in this case, the preceptor added information that the intern may or may not have been aware of. And then shifting on to comparing. Well, I think I see things a little differently. We have two goals here: nutrition care of the patient and your learning. My concerns are that I need to observe XYZ before I can offer you that level of independence. For the next 2 days, you'll do the assessments, including the patient interview, information gathering only, document your thought processes, and come find me with your plans before implementing them. We will review them, and then the approved plan will be implemented. Let's meet Thursday morning and decide how much independence for the rest of the remainder. How does that sound? So, an example of a conversation happened, that was handled very, very well. And so going into something like that, again, using the ABC structure can be a bit of a framework. And this is a really good example where we might have the opportunity to prepare in advance. Doing this on the fly sometimes isn't as easy. For the next piece, and I'm really wishing that I had this in larger font, so I will have to go to the next slide because then I can read it. Now we're on to a very touchy and personal issue that may come up. And I'm curious, and I'll put it out to the group in terms of how others might respond to this. In this case, the preceptor says, I didn't actually breach the subject as I didn't want to offend the student. She never seemed to brush her hair. How do you bring that up? At this point, probably, I'd be thinking, does it really matter? Maybe it does. And so it's a personal thing. And so I think that I'd be certainly going through some of that self-questioning. I couldn't tell if it was the lack of style or the lack of caring. I'd love to hear how someone has addressed issues of professional appearance. So here's my stab at it. And I invite people to think about how they might handle it differently. And I'll start with a quote. When misapplied compassion rules over honesty, people can go for years without being given information that could be extremely helpful. So for me, that gives me the courage to step into a difficult conversation. That, if this is the case for the intern, it could have a negative impact on her, not necessarily on her performance, but on her ability to be able to, project herself how she might want to. So I think, okay, well, I think it warrants a conversation. Establish mutual purpose. So one way of going at it, and this isn't the magic terminology, but what I thought is, well, explain that your reluctance to bring up the issue because of its personal nature, but since the problem may be interfering with the intern's effectiveness, you really must. And so providing some kind of context, why even to get into the conversation. And here's a stab at it. It's human nature to form opinions based on first impressions, and a big part of that is appearance. Some patients and staff may be more on the conservative side and see your hairstyle as messy, and that may make them anticipate that your work is careless, which I'm not saying that it is, and I don't think that you want it to be. What do you think? And that may be enough. If it was a different scenario, it might be helpful to go on and develop some kind of a solution strategy, but in this case, I'm not sure I would take it much further than that. I think in this case, for me, my challenge would be to stop, enough said. That at some point just bringing it up, it's a personal issue and not to make it embarrassing. So perhaps I'll pause for a moment here and I'll see if we want to put it out to a group. And I'll give the group here a chance because I've got live eyes. And then maybe I'll go to one other site. If I could randomly pick Sylvia in Abbotsford. So any thoughts in here in terms of how you might want to build on that from the Prince George audience? Has anybody in this audience perhaps dealt with a situation before?
Like on this topic?
Yeah, on the topic of something personal. It doesn't have to be hairstyle, but something about the personal appearance. It could be, other examples I've heard have been around body odor would be a really personal, touchy kind of one. Like, how do you even get into that? And yet the reality is that, ideally it would be a partner, a family member. If there's a really safe kind of a context, you'd want to be able to have that because, gosh, that person probably wouldn't want other people to be experiencing what they're experiencing. And so if there is a safe enough environment, if there is enough, then you can get into these very touchy and personal pieces to the degree of comfort that an intern might feel comfortable, when it can impact on performance. And by impacting on performance, I don't mean that it's their actual, it's impacting on the perception of their performance. That's a more accurate way to put it, because I remember I had quite an extravagant hairstyle when I was in my internship, and it didn't impact my performance. But I actually did have a preceptor who kindly told me, and she said, I'm not sure this is giving the image that you want to. Maybe it is. That's up to you. And it just made me think about it.
We've had conversations certainly about dress, and those are not easy ones to have either, right? See-through shirts and skirts that are too short.
Yeah.
Tops too high.
Yeah.
Jeans too tight out in community if you're doing a community forum and you're just like, why would you wear that?
Yeah. So some of the examples here were around dress. When I did my internship, I was given a dress code. And so this is an example of what happens if it's not handled well. And so I was given a dress code, and it was sensible shoes, neutral stockings, and a navy blue skirt or dress. Well, I showed up in a short skirt, which was navy blue, with sensible shoes and neutral stockings. And so I followed the rules. But obviously, that wasn't the image that I was... If I had thought about it, if I had been prompted kindly and gently, then I probably wouldn't have continued to do that to the same degree. So dress is another good example. So Sylvia, I had given you a bit of a heads up. Any thoughts from your group?
Yeah, we were having a conversation here. Nobody here has really indicated that they've had experience. From my perspective, I've had some conversations in the past when I've been a preceptor, and I think sometimes it comes down to is you don't, like this around dress, I don't really want to interfere with anybody's personal style, but sometimes it is a situation where people, like an intern, may not realize that how they choose to express themselves in one scenario can be very different than what's happening in what will be their professional work environment. So I think it's just the opportunity, I've had just the opportunity to just say to people, something that you might want to think about, that in this environment, when you take a look at the clientele that we have, what type of impression that you're giving. And some people, they've taken that to heart and they said, okay, thank you for telling me that. And I do know that some people choose to dress differently in their private life than what they choose to dress in their professional life. So it's a hard one to approach, and thankfully I haven't had to do it very often. So
that's really helpful. And just to echo one piece back, because I'm just intrigued by this whole concept of contrasting, is that's what I just heard a really good example of. I don't want you to think that your private style is really my business. That's your choice to make. But I do want to let you know how this might be perceived in this kind of a situation. So that's a great example. Thank you, Sylvia.
What do you do when they actually say, well, doesn't bother me, I'm going to continue dressing this way though? Like, then really, do you?
That's a good question. So the question is, what do you do when they've received that kind of feedback and they choose to continue? And I guess part of that might be up to the organization if they do have a dress code.
Like the messy hair would be one example.
Oh, I see.
Right?
Yeah.
It's not against the law to
Yeah.
have messy hair. You just leave them go, and I guess.
Any thoughts?
I think you would have to figure for yourself if it really mattered or not, like that. Like if they said, no, I disagree, and you could really think about it and think, okay, I guess if they have messy hair, it doesn't matter. But if it was like something that was obviously inappropriate or offensive to other people, then I guess, I don't know how you would broach it, but you'd have to be more firm in like enforcing your opinion, that it's not really just a matter of opinion, this is what the organization would kind of want you to do, and that is, I don't know.
I'll just share that with
It's
the
not
audience in
personal
case.
style, yeah.
That's right, just in case you weren't able to hear. So the question was in terms of if they continue, what do you do? And then the idea was then to bring it back and to have the conversation further, and more so to think about if it really mattered. Yeah, and I would agree. The other piece I would add to that is in thinking about if it really matters, linking it to patient population client outcomes. Say the example is in terms of short skirts or very low cut tops. You know, I noticed when you were giving, this could be an example, I noticed when you were giving the interview with the heart health client and you were leaning over to go through some of the materials, it was very distracting for him because he was more busy taking a look at your shirt, you know, than at the information. And so that gives them an example to relate about if it does matter. And in some cases, maybe if it doesn't link to patient population outcomes, it's a trickier conversation. Then it's really going to reflect on that intern. But I think that's an interesting conversation to continue. So what I would suggest now, in the interest of time, the next slide is specific tips for providing feedback. You do have access to the slides, and I think that they're self-explanatory and really good practical tips. And again, I'd like to credit Peter Lamb for them. The next two slides, we don't need to go through them, but what I'll invite you to do is to take a look at those. Those are two more examples that preceptors have shared about difficult conversations that they've had. And so within your groups and at your sites and in your practice groups, it's a good chance to try and work through it. The one that's on the screen now, it might be good to tease it apart. Terrible notes while doing clinical relief secondary to student having a less than acceptable preceptor in clinical 2 who didn't teach her to do proper charting. I had the intern in tears and had to notify my manager about the terrible job the previous preceptor had done with teaching interns to change or to chart. So that would be a really interesting one to be able to work through either with one other preceptor or in a group you have to try and test out some of these tools, see if it even works with you, see how, if you were in that situation with that kind of an intern, how you might be able to respond to the intern. And I wondered if this was the intern where the conversation had taken place. This is where an apology might help. Oh, gee, you know, I can understand, not to at all criticize the previous preceptor, I can understand how you might have been given mixed messages around the charting and been given different guidelines. And I've actually heard that a lot, and part of that is the experience of being an intern. So to think about how to handle the conversation with the intern, and then to think about how to handle it with the colleague as well. Because throughout the whole preceptoring, certainly your experience or your connecting with your colleagues' work as well. So thinking of next steps, those are two examples that you could take that you could pull apart and explore with your peers how you might deal with them. And then on the last slide that starts with for more, so one slide further. For more information, reading, there's the reference to the book that I used as a bit of a framework for this. Resources to practice on the DC website under Career, Mentoring, Preceptoring, and Preceptoring Resources. You got to dig a little bit. I was pointed in this direction, and still after a year mining the DC website and finding stuff, but there is two resources that I thought might be particularly helpful. The first one, Whose Problem Is It Anyways? Responding to the Intern Performance Issues. And this is Daphne Lordley from out in Nova Scotia. And she presents some ideas very much around thinking about mirroring back on ourselves and starting with ourselves first. And then also having some really good tips on feedback. The focus on feedback has some case studies to work through. So again, looking at scenarios that I'm sure that you may have already encountered through your preceptorship. So with that, I'll hand it back over to you, Teresa, because I know that we're running out of time here.